Hello, tonight. You are not arriving anywhere in a hurry, because nothing in this place has ever truly rushed. A very old world begins to open gently around you, like a door that does not creak, even though it has not been touched for thousands of years. Somewhere beyond thought, you begin to wonder what it means when silence itself feels alive, and patient Dot, you slowly step into the wide breadth of Mesopotamia, where the land stretches between two rivers that move like soft memory rather than water. The Tigris and Euphrates flow quietly, as if they are remembering where to go instead of deciding. The air feels warm and still, and even the birds seem unsure whether to hurry or simply enjoy existing. A farmer nearby looks at the sky like it might give instructions, but even it looks relaxed today. Somewhere, you almost expect a notification sound from the sky, but only wind responds. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. And as you listen from wherever you are in the world, you might also leave a comment about your location and what time it is right now, because time feels strangely different in stories like this, almost like it forgot to be strict. Now, slowly, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking across soil that feels both familiar and ancient, as if it has been shaped by countless quiet footsteps long before yours. This is the land between rivers where early settlements begin to gather into something resembling cities. In the distance, faint shapes of walls and simple buildings appear, not towering, but steady, like calm thoughts made visible. The city of Uruk begins to form in your view, not suddenly, but gradually, like a memory returning. Its structures rise from dust and sunlight with a softness that feels almost unreal. Here, people move with predictable rhythm, carrying baskets, clay, and grain. Life feels organized, but never rushed, like a story told by someone who enjoys long pauses between sentences. You notice that most sounds are gentle: footsteps on packed earth, the low voices of traders, and the distant bleating of animals. Nothing feels sharp or aggressive. Even decisions seem to arrive slowly, as if thought itself prefers to walk rather than run. A nearby child stares at a goat with deep seriousness, as though it might explain the universe if observed long enough. The rivers remain constant companions, shaping everything without demanding attention. Water moves through channels that humans carefully guide, yet never fully control. It feels like a partnership between patience and necessity. You might notice how even modern life feels strangely loud in comparison, as if your own world forgot how to whisper in this early civilization. Power does not gather in armies or loud declarations. Instead, it rests inside temples, where priests and temple administrators organize grain, offerings, and time itself. Authority feels more like maintenance than command. It is as if someone is quietly keeping the world tidy rather than ruling. Even leadership seems to breathe slowly here. You walk past a temple structure rising in stepped layers, a ziggurat, where each level feels like a gentle step toward the sky. People move in and out, carrying records and offerings, as if managing both physical and invisible worlds together. Knowledge is stored quietly here, like thoughts pressed carefully into soft clay tablets without noise. Trade happens in small exchanges between people: grain for tools, wool for pottery, and sometimes stories for smiles shared in passing. Everything feels balanced, as if the world is still experimenting with fairness through repetition. You even imagine that if someone rushed a transaction, the market would politely ask them to slow down and breathe again. You begin to understand that governance here is not built on force, but on repetition and trust that grows through daily practice. Temples coordinate resources, track harvests, and ensure no one is forgotten within the cycle of survival. This quiet order feels natural, as if civilization is learning to breathe slowly for the first time without strain. Everything around you moves with steady calm, as though structure and life are quietly synchronized without effort or pressure. People continue their work, unaware of complexity beneath routine actions. You sense that this system survives not through command, but through shared habits repeated over generations, forming a rhythm that feels as gentle as flowing air. Historically, this is the world of early Mesopotamia, where Uruk emerges around 4000 BCE as one of the earliest known cities. Here, something remarkable begins to happen. Symbols pressed into clay start to represent spoken words. Writing is not yet art or literature, but a practical memory system for grain and trade, quietly changing human history without announcing itself. You watch scribes carefully pressing reed styluses into soft clay tablets, leaving marks that will harden into permanence under the sun. Each impression feels small, but together they begin to form the foundation of recorded thought. It is strangely comforting, like watching humanity discover it does not have to forget everything anymore. Life continues in steady cycles, planting, harvesting, storing, and sharing. People seem deeply connected to the rhythm of the land, as if they are part of it rather than separate from it. Even time feels circular here, not linear, like it prefers returning to familiar places instead of moving too far ahead. There is no sense of urgency in the air, only continuity. Power exists, but it is soft, distributed through rituals, roles, and shared understanding. You might even think of it as a quiet agreement between people and the world itself. Somewhere nearby, a goat knocks over a clay pot, and nobody seems particularly surprised, as if chaos here has very polite manners. The sun lowers slowly over Uruk, painting the river with a pale golden reflection that feels almost endless. Everything remains calm, as if the world is resting between thoughts. You are still here, standing in a civilization that has not yet learned the language of war, only the language of balance. And in this quiet beginning, the story gently continues onward. You continue walking through the quiet landscape of early Mesopotamia, where the horizon no longer feels like a single open land, but instead begins to separate into small, self-contained worlds. Each settlement appears like a gentle island of order, surrounded by fields and canals. The air remains calm, and even the wind seems to move carefully, as if respecting invisible boundaries drawn long before maps existed, or were even imagined. As you move forward, you begin to notice that these lands are no longer unified in feeling. Instead, they form a collection of city-states, each one holding its own rhythm of life. These are the cities of Sumer, operating like quiet islands of authority. A modern thought briefly crosses your mind that even ancient civilizations somehow understood local government, just without email complaints or budget spreadsheets. Each city feels self-contained, with its own identity, customs, and sense of order. There is no single center pulling everything together, only a soft network of independence. You sense that travel between them is peaceful but deliberate, like visiting neighbors who are polite but slightly protective of their kitchen recipes. The world here is connected, yet carefully separated at the same time. In the distance, you notice structures rising again, and you recognize them as ziggurats, steady and layered like staircases built for thoughts rather than people. These structures are not only temples, but also administrative hearts of each city. You might imagine them as ancient office buildings, except with fewer complaints about air conditioning and more prayers, directed toward grain supply and seasonal balance. Within these cities, authority rests in the hands of the Ensi ruler priests, who hold both spiritual and administrative responsibilities. They guide harvests, organize labor, and maintain rituals that connect daily life with the divine. Their role feels less like commanding and more like carefully maintaining a delicate system, as if civilization is a very large garden that needs constant but gentle attention. You pass by a group of workers carrying baskets of barley toward temple storage. Their movements are calm, repetitive, and deeply familiar to them. There is no sense of urgency, only structure. One worker jokingly nudges another, and for a moment, you realize that even in ancient systems of authority, humor quietly survives. Like a small flame refusing to be extinguished by time. The ziggurat ahead stands as both sacred space and administrative center. Inside its clay walls, scribes record trade, offerings, and grain distribution. These records are not abstract. They are survival itself written into symbols. You might think of it as the world's earliest spreadsheet system, except instead of crashing software, it only risks a broken clay tablet if someone drops it. Historically, this is the world of Sumerian city-states such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, each operating independently, yet sharing cultural roots. You feel how civilization is still experimenting with structure, like a mind slowly organizing its own thoughts. There is no empire yet, only many small centers of organized life, each believing its version of order is naturally correct. You begin to notice that trade between these cities is more common than conflict. Goods move along canals and roads. Grain, wool, pottery, and copper. Exchanges are steady and predictable. A merchant passes you and smiles briefly, as if business here is less about profit and more about maintaining balance, like adjusting scales that never stay perfectly still. Even communication between cities feels slow and thoughtful. Messages travel by messengers on foot or small boats along irrigation channels. There is patience built into every exchange. You briefly imagine how different this is from your modern world, where messages arrive instantly and still somehow feel delayed. Here, time itself seems to approve of waiting. Inside each city, the temple complex functions as both spiritual heart and economic center. Grain is measured, stored, and distributed under its supervision. This dual role creates a sense that religion and administration are not separate ideas, but different expressions of the same quiet system. Everything feels integrated, like a single organism breathing slowly through many small parts. Yet beneath this stability, you begin to sense something subtle. Each city exists as its own world. There is no strong unity binding them into one structure. This independence creates balance, but also quiet fragility. It is like several boats floating on the same river, each stable on its own, but not tied together in any meaningful way. A historical truth emerges here. Ziggurats are not only religious monuments, but also early administrative centers, storing economic records written on clay tablets. These tablets preserve information about trade, food, and labor distribution. You might think of them as humanity's earliest data centers, except instead of electricity, they rely entirely on sunlight and patience to preserve information. You watch scribes carefully shaping wet clay with reed styluses, creating marks that will harden into permanent records. Their movements are slow and precise, almost meditative. Each symbol carries meaning that helps maintain the city's structure. It feels strangely peaceful, as if bureaucracy here is not stressful, but instead a form of quiet storytelling about daily survival. Life in these cities continues with a steady rhythm. Farmers tend fields outside city walls, while artisans shape tools and vessels inside. Everything feels interconnected, but not centralized. You notice that even silence has structure here, as if the world itself prefers order without needing loud declarations or strict enforcement. You begin to understand that power in this world is not aggressive, but distributed across temples, labor systems, and shared belief. It is stable, but not unified. A small humorous thought appears. Even ancient cities might struggle with too many meanings that could have been clay tablets instead. Though no one here would ever say it out loud. As evening approaches, the cities of Sumer rest under a soft light that touches each ziggurat equally, as if acknowledging their independence. Shadows lengthen across canals and fields, and the air grows still. You sense a balance settling over the land, calm yet unfinished, like something gently holding its breath. You feel that this world is balanced, yet quietly incomplete, like a sentence waiting for its final clause. Nothing feels resolved, only paused in time. And in this gentle tension, the story naturally continues forward into what comes next, as if history itself prefers to unfold slowly, without urgency, under fading light. You move beyond the quiet city-states of Sumer, where the land begins to feel less settled and more open, as if it is breathing in wider patterns. The canals grow less predictable, and the roads stretch farther into uncertain space. Everything feels slightly less defined here, like the world is gently forgetting where its own edges are supposed to be. At the distant edges of this landscape, you notice movement increasing. Small groups of travelers, herders, and traders cross paths with a rhythm that feels less local and more wandering. They do not belong to a single city, but instead carry fragments of many places. Even their conversations feel like mixtures of accents and memories from faraway regions. You begin to understand that this is a world where borders are not fixed lines, but soft transitions. People move according to seasons, water, and opportunity. A herd passes slowly, raising dust that lingers in the air like unfinished thoughts. Even time here feels migratory, as if it prefers not to stay in one place for too long. Among these movements, you sense the rise of something new, not yet fully formed, but growing through connection rather than isolation. It is not a single city or ruler, but a pattern of relationships spreading across regions. You might think of it as early networking, except instead of servers and cables, it is made of roads, rivers, and human memory. Trade routes become more active as you walk further. Goods travel farther than ever before. Copper from distant hills, wool from open plains, and grains stored from river valleys. Every exchange creates invisible threads between communities. It feels as if the land itself is slowly weaving into a larger fabric without announcing what it is becoming. You notice that these expanding connections begin to change how people think about resources. What was once enough for a single city now feels limited when shared across many. Fields that once felt abundant begin to carry subtle pressure. A merchant jokes lightly about rising prices, as if even ancient economies enjoyed their own quiet sense of irony. Farther along the route, you encounter groups who live more nomadically, moving between settled regions. They carry stories as much as goods, and their presence reminds you that civilization is not always stationary. Their lifestyle feels flexible, adaptive, and slightly mysterious, like a conversation that never fully commits to a single conclusion. Historically, this is the broader environment in which early Akkadian influence begins to emerge. You sense that power is no longer confined to individual city walls, but gradually extends beyond them. Authority starts to reorganize itself across regions, shaped by relationships, communication, and shared needs rather than isolated centers of control within each independent city. Instead, it starts to flow through networks of alliances and movement, connecting settlements across distance in increasingly coordinated patterns. This shift is subtle, like water finding new channels without breaking the surface of the land it passes through. You feel how influence spreads quietly, reshaping balance and direction, without sudden disruption or visible resistance from the world around it. You hear the name Sargon of Akkad mentioned in later reflections of this era, a figure associated with the unification of multiple Sumerian city-states. His rise is not immediate or sudden, but part of a longer transformation already in motion. It feels less like conquest in a single moment, and more like consolidation over time. As you continue walking, you begin to notice that smaller communities sometimes align themselves with stronger centers for protection or stability. These relationships are not always forced. Some are chosen, shaped by practicality rather than ideology. You might compare it to joining a larger system, simply because it makes daily life feel more predictable. The land itself appears to respond to these changes. Irrigation systems expand, trade routes become more structured, and communication slowly improves. Yet there is still no single center controlling everything. Instead, influence spreads like overlapping ripples on water, each one interacting gently with the next without fully merging into one shape. You pass a caravan resting near a canal, where travelers share food and rest quietly under open sky. Their conversations mix languages and experiences, creating a soft soundscape of human movement. One traveler laughs about getting lost and ending up exactly where they intended to be, as if direction here is sometimes more philosophical than geographical. The idea of power begins to feel different in this landscape. It is no longer just about ruling a city, but about maintaining connections across distance. Those who can organize movement, resources, and communication begin to gain influence. Power, you realize, is slowly becoming something that flows rather than something that sits still. A historical truth becomes clearer here. The emergence of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon represents one of the earliest known attempts to unify multiple independent city-states under centralized authority. This process unfolds gradually, shaped by alliances, administration, and expanding influence rather than sudden conquest. You sense how unity is formed through structure rather than instant transformation. This unification does not erase local identities immediately, but instead slowly reshapes how regions relate to one another over time. Cities continue their familiar traditions, yet they now exist within a broader framework of coordination and oversight. Over generations, relationships between regions begin to reflect this new balance, where independence and integration quietly coexist. You sense that this transformation is not universally felt as dramatic. For many people, daily life continues with only small adjustments. The same fields are harvested, the same markets operate, and the same rivers are crossed. Yet beneath this continuity, the structure of connection is slowly tightening, like a net being gently gathered. As evening light spreads across the open landscape, you notice how the horizon seems less like a boundary and more like a meeting place. Distant movements of people, animals, and goods create a quiet rhythm that feels almost musical. Even silence here feels connected, as if it is listening to everything passing through it. You stand at the edge of this shifting world, sensing that something larger is forming not through sudden force, but through accumulation of connections over time. Nothing has fully changed yet, but everything is beginning to lean in a new direction. And in that gentle turning, the story continues forward, without resistance. You continue your journey through Mesopotamia, where the land begins to feel less like a single place and more like a crossing point for many invisible directions. The rivers still guide everything gently, but now you notice how paths of movement naturally converge here. It feels as if geography itself has chosen this region to be quietly important without ever announcing it. As you walk, you begin to sense why so many groups pass through this land. Mesopotamia sits between natural routes that connect distant regions, making it less of a destination and more of a corridor. Traders, herders, and messengers move through it constantly, like thoughts passing through an open mind that never fully closes or forgets what it has seen. The soil beneath your feet feels rich and steady, shaped by centuries of river deposits. You notice fields of barley stretching calmly under the light wind, their growth supported by predictable cycles of flooding and renewal. Everything here seems designed for continuity rather than sudden change, as if the land itself prefers long-term stability over dramatic transformation. You pass by farmers who work with a calm rhythm, planting and harvesting in patterns passed down through generations. Their tools are simple, yet effective, shaped by necessity rather than excess. There is a quiet confidence in their movements, as if they understand that survival here depends not on intensity, but on patience repeated over time, not in nearby workshops. You observe artisans shaping tools from copper and stone. These materials arrive through trade networks that stretch far beyond the horizon. Even though the land itself does not contain everything, it benefits from its position between resource-rich regions. You begin to understand that value here is not only produced, but also collected through connection. A small merchant group passes by, carrying goods wrapped in cloth and stored in woven baskets. They speak softly, exchanging information about routes and conditions ahead. One of them jokes about how every journey feels like a negotiation with the landscape itself, as if the ground might suddenly decide to become less cooperative if not treated with respect. You notice that the rivers continue to act as natural highways, guiding movement with gentle reliability. Boats drift slowly along currents that require little force to follow. This ease of transportation makes exchange more frequent, and with every exchange, the importance of this region quietly increases. It feels like influence is accumulating, without anyone actively trying to collect it. Historically, this is why Mesopotamia becomes known as the cradle of civilization, a region where early human societies first developed agriculture, writing, and urban organization. You sense how multiple innovations seem to emerge naturally here, as if the environment itself encourages complexity. Even modern thinking often returns here, when searching for the origins of structured human life. As you move further, you begin to understand the absence of natural barriers in this land. There are no great mountain ranges to isolate communities, and no vast seas to block movement. Instead, the terrain remains open and accessible, allowing ideas, goods, and people to flow freely. This openness creates opportunity, but also quiet vulnerability over long periods. You imagine how this lack of natural defense changes the nature of power in the region. Control is not enforced by geography, but by organization and presence. Whoever can manage movement through this open space gains influence. It feels less like owning territory and more like guiding circulation, similar to how one might gently steer water through channels. Small settlements appear along your path, each benefiting from proximity to trade routes. These communities do not stand in isolation, but exist as points within larger networks. You notice how their prosperity often depends less on internal strength and more on their ability to remain connected. Even survival here seems to reward openness rather than separation. A group of travelers rests near a canal, sharing food and exchanging news from distant cities. Their conversations reveal how quickly information spreads across this interconnected land. One traveler remarks that news here travels faster than people do, which earns a quiet laugh from the group, as if even ancient communication systems understood the humor of delayed reactions. You begin to see how natural resources reinforce this region's importance. Barley fields provide consistent harvests, clay supports construction and writing, and river systems sustain agriculture year after year. These stable elements create a foundation that attracts attention from surrounding regions. Value here is not explosive, but steady, like a quiet flame that never fully goes out. Trade becomes more than exchange. It becomes structure. Roads and river routes define how communities interact, and these patterns slowly shape political influence. You notice that power often follows trade rather than leading it. It is as if control is drawn toward areas where movement is already organized, rather than being imposed from outside. A historical truth becomes clear. Mesopotamia's strategic position between Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, and the Arabian regions makes it a natural center of early cultural and economic exchange. This central placement shapes continuous movement of people, goods, and ideas across wide distances, creating a landscape where interaction becomes routine rather than exceptional or rare. This centrality allows ideas and technologies to spread efficiently across interconnected regions without needing forceful direction. Innovations in farming, writing, and administration move along trade routes and settlements, gradually influencing many societies. You sense how geography quietly shapes history long before any single ruler attempts to define or control a broader patterns of human development. As the light softens over the fields, you notice how everything feels interconnected without being unified. Cities, rivers, and trade routes form a loose but powerful web, stretching across distance in quiet coordination. Nothing here feels forced together, yet everything influences everything else in subtle and continuous ways. It is a system built not through deliberate design, but through long patterns of interaction over time. Each exchange, movement, and connection adds another layer to this invisible structure. You sense how order can emerge slowly, shaped by repetition and proximity, until it becomes the natural background of everyday life without needing direction or control. You stand in the fading light, realizing that the value of this land does not come from dominance, but from accessibility. It is easy to reach, easy to pass through, and therefore impossible to ignore. And in that quiet realization, you feel the story naturally preparing for the next movement of its slow unfolding rhythm. You continue walking through Mesopotamia, but something subtle has changed in the air around you. The land still looks familiar, yet the relationships between its cities feel slightly more connected, like threads being gently tightened without breaking anything. Nothing dramatic appears on the surface, while everything remains calm and unchanged. Beneath everyday life, a slow reorganization of influence is beginning to take shape across regions and settlements. Connections grow stronger without visible disruption, forming patterns that are difficult to notice at first glance. You sense how coordination increases gradually, as if the land itself is learning new ways to relate quietly. As you move closer to settlements, you notice that small alliances are forming between cities that once acted more independently. These connections are not forced or sudden, but negotiated quietly over time. They feel like agreements built on convenience and necessity rather than ideology, as if survival itself prefers cooperation over isolation when conditions become increasingly interconnected. You pass through a marketplace where goods arrive from distant regions under shared arrangements of protection. Merchants speak about safer routes and reduced risks, thanks to agreements between powerful centers and smaller cities. One trader jokingly says he pays less in fear than he used to in taxes, and that line lingers strangely in the calm air. The idea of protection begins to replace the older sense of independence in subtle ways. Smaller city-states accept support from stronger centers in exchange for stability. You sense that this exchange is not always viewed as loss, but sometimes as relief. Life becomes more predictable, even if it quietly shifts the balance of control. Across regions, temples and administrative centers continue to function as before, yet their relationships with external authority become more structured. You notice messengers arriving more frequently, carrying instructions and records rather than simple trade notes. The flow of information becomes a tool of coordination, gently shaping behavior without the need for visible force or disruption. You observe how influence spreads not through conquest alone, but through repeated interactions. Trade agreements, shared grain storage systems, and tax arrangements slowly create dependency. It feels like water seeping into soil, gradually changing its composition without altering its surface appearance immediately. The transformation is quiet, continuous, and almost invisible unless you stand still long enough to notice. Historically, this is the period in which the Akkadian Empire begins extending its influence over Sumerian city-states. Rather than erasing existing structures, it incorporates them into a larger administrative system. You sense that governance here evolves through adaptation rather than replacement, preserving familiar forms while subtly redirecting how power flows through them. You walk past a group of local officials discussing resource distribution with representatives from a larger political center. Their conversation is calm, even routine, as if such arrangements have become a normal part of civic life. You realize that authority no longer feels distant or foreign, but integrated into the rhythm of daily administrative practice. In some cities, you notice that local rulers still remain in place, but their roles are now connected to broader systems of oversight. Instead of direct removal, they operate within a network of accountability. This creates an interesting duality, where local identity persists while larger coordination slowly guides decisions from a wider scale. You pass by agricultural fields where harvests are collected and measured with increasing precision. Part of the yield is allocated through structured systems that connect multiple regions. Farmers continue their work as before, but now their output becomes part of a larger network of distribution. It feels like individual effort is being quietly woven into collective organization. A traveling official explains to a group of locals how standardized measures help reduce confusion in trade and taxation. His tone is calm and practical, focused on efficiency rather than authority. You notice how acceptance grows when systems appear useful rather than imposed. Even change here seems to succeed through familiarity instead of resistance. You begin to understand that the boundaries between independence and dependency are becoming less distinct. Some cities retain their local customs, yet rely increasingly on external structures for security and trade stability. This creates a layered reality where identity and control overlap, making it difficult to define exactly where one ends and the other begins. A historical truth becomes clearer here. Under Akkadian rule, many Sumerian cities are governed through appointed governors rather than direct destruction of existing institutions. This approach allows continuity while shifting ultimate authority upward. You sense how this method creates stability without visible rupture, making transformation feel like evolution rather than disruption. In quiet conversations between traders, you hear references to safer routes and standardized systems that reduce uncertainty across long distances. These improvements are appreciated, even when they come with new obligations. You notice how people tend to accept structural change more easily when it increases predictability in their everyday lives, even if they do not fully notice its long-term consequences. The landscape itself seems to reflect this gradual integration. Roads are maintained more consistently, and communication between cities becomes smoother. Yet there is still no single visible center dominating everything. Instead, influence spreads through overlapping systems, like soft shadows extending across familiar ground without fully obscuring it, shaping movement, trade, and interaction in subtle but continuous ways across regions. As evening approaches, you observe how life continues almost unchanged on the surface. Families gather, markets close slowly, and canals reflect fading light. The ordinary rhythm of daily existence remains steady and reassuring. People move through familiar routines without urgency, unaware of how these small patterns collectively support a much larger and increasingly coordinated structure forming beneath their awareness. Beneath this calm exterior, however, a deeper structure is quietly forming, organizing movement and interaction across a wider space than before, linking communities in ways that feel increasingly natural. This structure does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it grows through repetition, agreement, and habit, gradually shaping how resources, information, and people flow between regions over long periods of time. You stand at the edge of this expanding system, sensing that power here does not arrive with force, but with gradual acceptance. It spreads gently, almost politely, until it becomes part of the environment itself. And as the shadows lengthen across the land, you feel the story moving forward without urgency, into its next quiet transformation beyond sight. You continue moving through the familiar lands of Mesopotamia, but something subtle has shifted in how authority feels around you. It is not a dramatic change, nor a moment marked by sound or spectacle. Instead, it resembles a quiet reorganization of responsibility, as if the structure of governance itself is gently adjusting its internal pathways without disturbing daily life on the surface. As you walk closer to city centers, you notice administrative activity becoming more coordinated across regions. Messages now arrive with greater consistency, and decisions feel increasingly aligned with a broader framework. Yet everything still looks familiar. The same temples, the same markets, the same steady rhythm of people working and resting under. The same sun that has always risen over these lands. In the marketplaces, traders continue exchanging goods as they always have. Grain is measured, clay vessels are stacked, and animals are guided through narrow pathways between stalls. There is no disruption in these routines, only a subtle awareness that certain approvals or permissions now come from a more distant center. Even if the process of daily exchange remains unchanged in appearance, you hear conversations that reflect this quiet transition. People speak of new administrative confirmations, revised records, and broader coordination between cities. Yet there is no tone of alarm in their voices. Instead, there is acceptance, as if these changes are simply adjustments in the background structure of life. Like seasonal shifts that do not require explanation or resistance to understand. Temples continue their essential roles, recording harvests and managing resources, but now their ledgers align with wider systems of authority. You observe scribes working carefully over clay tablets, their movements calm and precise. It feels as though bureaucracy itself has expanded outward, not replacing what existed before, but gently absorbing it into a larger, more connected framework. Historically, this period reflects the gradual decline of the Akkadian Empire, which does not collapse in a single moment, but dissolves over time through internal strain and regional fragmentation. You sense how historical change here behaves less like an event and more like a slow dispersal, where structure loosens gradually until its edges become indistinct. As you pass through smaller settlements, life appears almost entirely uninterrupted. Farmers still tend their fields, children still play near irrigation channels, and artisans continue shaping tools with practiced ease. The continuity of daily existence remains strong, suggesting that political transformation often moves slower than human habit, which tends to preserve rhythm even when systems above it begin to shift. You notice that some officials appear uncertain about higher directives, yet local governance continues functioning without collapse. Instructions arrive less predictably than before, but communities adapt naturally, relying on established practices to maintain order. It feels as if the world is gently learning how to operate with less centralized clarity without losing its essential stability. Trade routes remain active, though they now carry subtle changes in oversight. Merchants adjust to new administrative expectations while continuing their journeys across familiar paths. There is a quiet resilience in their behavior, as if movement itself is more fundamental than the structures that govern it. The roads remain the same even if the names of those who manage them begin to change. You begin to understand that sovereignty here is not a sharp boundary, but a layered condition. Cities do not suddenly lose autonomy. Instead, their authority becomes increasingly interwoven with external systems. This creates a gradual blending where independence and integration coexist, making it difficult to identify the exact moment when one fully transitions into the other. In the background of this transformation, Scribes continue recording transactions, earths and distributions of grain. Their work does not pause, even as administrative frameworks evolve above them. You realize that written records serve as a kind of continuity, preserving structure even when political arrangements shift. In this sense, writing becomes a quiet anchor for civilization itself. You hear a local elder describing how life feels the same, but arranged differently, a phrase that captures the essence of this period. People adapt not by resisting change, but by adjusting their understanding of where authority originates. It is not disruption they experience, but reorientation, as if familiar paths now lead through slightly altered landscapes. The historical collapse of the Akkadian Empire is best understood as a gradual process influenced by climate stress, regional uprisings, and administrative fragmentation across distant territories. You sense how droughts and resource pressures quietly weaken stability, while local regions begin to act with increasing independence, creating a slow shift in balance that unfolds over many generations rather than in a single decisive moment. You sense how these factors do not create a single dramatic moment, but instead produce a slow weakening of cohesion across the empire's vast network of cities and provinces. Power disperses outward, not through sudden loss, but through incremental separation of connections between administrators, regions, and trade routes, until unity becomes something remembered rather than actively maintained. Even as central authority weakens, the systems it created do not vanish immediately. Local administrators continue using established methods, maintaining continuity in taxation, trade, and record-keeping. You observe how institutions often outlive the conditions that formed them, persisting like echoes of earlier structures that still provide guidance, even after their origin has faded as evening approaches. The land feels steady and unchanged, even though its governance is quietly transforming beneath the surface. The sun casts the same warm light over fields and rivers, indifferent to administrative transitions happening far beyond immediate perception. You realize that history often unfolds slowly, hidden within ordinary life, unnoticed by those who continue their daily routines without questioning its rhythm. You stand at the edge of this subtle transformation, sensing that what has changed is not the world itself, but the arrangement of its connections between cities, people, and systems. Nothing is broken suddenly, yet everything has shifted gently into a new configuration. Influence moves differently now, shaping relationships in ways that are felt more than seen across the land. And as the light softens across the horizon, the story continues forward without interruption, moving deeper into its quiet unfolding. The landscape remains calm, but your awareness of it has changed. You sense that history is never still, only rearranging itself slowly over time, carrying everything forward into another layer of continuity and change. You continue walking through Mesopotamia, where the land still feels familiar, yet the systems beneath daily life have quietly adjusted themselves into a new arrangement. Nothing appears dramatically different at first glance. The rivers still flow, the fields are still tended, and the same sun rises over the same horizon, as if history prefers subtle continuity over visible disruption. In the villages and cities you pass, people continue their daily work with steady familiarity. Farmers guide their tools across soil, shaped by generations, while artisans shape clay and metal with practiced hands. Life does not pause for political transformation. Instead, it flows alongside it, adapting quietly, like water adjusting its path around newly placed stones in a riverbed. You notice that administrative routines now carry a slightly different rhythm. Records are kept with greater standardization, and instructions arrive through more unified channels. Yet the people performing these tasks remain the same. Their movements are unchanged, only the framework surrounding their actions has shifted. Like a familiar melody played in a slightly different key in marketplaces, trade continues with its usual calm energy. Goods are exchanged, weights are measured, and agreements are made with quiet confidence. However, you begin to sense that larger coordination is making commerce more predictable across regions. Merchants benefit from broader consistency, even if they must adjust to new forms of oversight that connect distant cities more closely than before. Historical truth becomes clearer as you observe scribes at work. The Akkadian language gradually replaces Sumerian in administrative contexts, shaping how records are written and understood. You watch as new symbols appear more frequently on clay tablets, marking a slow but steady transition in how authority communicates with the world it governs. You pass by a group of traders resting beside a canoe, discussing routes that now feel safer due to improved coordination across territories. Their conversation reflects practical acceptance rather than resistance. One of them remarks that traveling feels less uncertain now, even if it comes with more paperwork, earning a soft laugh from the group under the warm afternoon light. In some communities, you notice that older traditions are still preserved in daily rituals and local customs, yet official matters increasingly follow standardized procedures. This creates a layered experience of life, where cultural memory and administrative structure coexist without conflict. It feels like two different rhythms playing simultaneously, neither fully replacing the other. You observe that some families choose to leave certain regions, seeking places where older systems remain more intact. Their departure is quiet and unhurried, not marked by fear, but by preference for familiarity. Meanwhile, most people remain, adapting gradually to new conditions, finding stability within evolving structures rather than outside them. In workshops and storage centers, you see increased efficiency in how resources are managed. Grain distribution follows more consistent records, and labor assignments are tracked with greater clarity. These changes do not disrupt daily life. Instead, they reduce uncertainty. You sense that many people appreciate predictability more than the abstract idea of independence. Even in conversation, subtle linguistic shifts become noticeable. Words from Akkadian usage appear more frequently in official contexts, while Sumerian expressions remain in everyday speech. This blending of language feels natural, as if communication itself is slowly reorganizing to match the broader structure of governance forming across the region. You pass a temple complex where scribes carefully copy texts onto fresh clay tablets. Their work reflects continuity rather than replacement, preserving knowledge while adapting language. The act of writing feels almost meditative, as if each symbol carries both memory and transition at once, linking past systems with emerging. Administrative order. Travelers along the roads speak of how coordination between cities has improved certain aspects of life. Supplies arrive more reliably, and disputes between regions are resolved through structured communication rather than prolonged uncertainty. You notice how these improvements are often accepted without question, as if efficiency itself justifies gradual transformation. Historically, this period reflects the continued integration of Akkadian administrative language across Mesopotamian governance systems throughout cities and regions. You sense how scribes increasingly adopt standardized terms, allowing communication between distant centers to become more consistent. This gradual linguistic shift does not erase older traditions immediately, but instead layers a new administrative framework over existing local expressions and practices. You sense how language here functions not only as communication, but also as a tool of structure, shaping how authority is perceived, organized, and maintained across regions. The written word becomes a bridge between shifting systems of power and everyday human activity, allowing governance to extend beyond presence, embedding control and coordination into records, decisions, and shared administrative understanding. Over time, you observe children learning basic counting and record keeping in ways that reflect this new order. Education, though informal, begins to align with administrative needs. It feels like the future is being quietly prepared, not through dramatic reform, but through incremental adjustments in how knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. In rural areas, life continues with even less visible change across fields, canals, and small settlements. Fields are still cultivated, water is still carefully managed, and seasonal cycles remain unchanged as always. Yet even here, the influence of broader systems appears in how surplus is recorded and distributed, quietly connecting local labor to wider administrative structures beyond daily awareness. You realize that transformation does not require uniform visibility to be effective across an entire region or population. Many changes operate beneath observation, shaping outcomes without altering immediate appearance. Even when daily routines seem identical, underlying systems may have already shifted, reorganizing how resources, responsibilities, and coordination flow between communities without disrupting the familiar rhythm of rural existence. As evening approaches, you notice how cities and villages alike settle into rhythms that feel both old and new at the same time. The landscape remains unchanged in form, yet the systems guiding human activity have subtly reconfigured themselves over time. It feels as if the world is learning how to maintain stability within change, rather than resisting transformation outright. You stand quietly at the edge of this evolving order, sensing that adaptation is not a single moment, but an ongoing process, unfolding across generations. People do not wake up to a new world. They simply continue living within one that has slowly adjusted around them. And as night begins to fall, the story continues its gentle unfolding without interruption. You continue your journey through Mesopotamia, where the landscape now feels shaped not only by rivers and soil, but also by systems of order that have settled gently into everyday life. The changes that once felt uncertain have now stabilized, forming a structure that operates quietly in the background, like a steady rhythm beneath the surface of familiar human activity. As you approach major settlements, you notice that administrative practices appear more uniform than before. Taxes are collected in a consistent manner, recorded with clarity, and distributed through organized channels. There is no visible tension in these processes. Instead, everything feels structured and predictable, as if uncertainty itself has been gradually refined out of daily governance. In local administrative centers, you observe officials working with calm efficiency. They manage records, oversee resources, and coordinate with neighboring regions through established procedures. Their roles feel less like distant authority and more like routine maintenance of a large, interconnected system. You sense that governance has become something people now expect rather than question or interpret. The provinces you pass through are no longer isolated units, but integrated parts of a broader structure. Each region retains its local identity, yet follows shared administrative guidelines that ensure consistency across distances. You begin to see how this balance between local familiarity and centralized coordination creates a sense of stability. Throughout the land, trade routes have become more reliable and predictable. Caravans move along established paths with fewer disruptions, carrying goods that reflect the interconnected nature of the empire. You notice how merchants plan their journeys with confidence, relying on systems that ensure supplies, protection, and communication across long distances without constant uncertainty. Historically, this reflects developments seen in later Imperial systems such as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where structured road networks and relay stations allowed information and resources to move efficiently across vast territories. You sense how infrastructure itself becomes a form of governance, shaping how quickly decisions and coordination can occur across regions. Along these routes, you encounter stations where messengers pause briefly before continuing their journeys. These points of exchange feel like quiet pulses within a larger system, ensuring that communication flows continuously. There is something almost rhythmic about this network, as if the empire breathes through structured intervals of movement. And rest. In agricultural regions, production continues with enhanced organization. Fields are still worked by hand, but distribution of output follows standardized systems that connect villages to larger administrative centers. You observe how this structure reduces uncertainty, allowing communities to focus on stability rather than constantly managing unpredictability. In resource allocation, even in distant settlements, the presence of governance feels familiar rather than intrusive. Officials are recognized not as external forces, but as part of the established order of life. Their presence is accepted as naturally as seasonal cycles, suggesting that authority has become integrated into the rhythm of daily existence rather than existing apart from it. You notice that written records now play an even greater role in maintaining consistency across regions. Tablets documenting taxes, trade, and labor move through administrative channels with careful regularity. Writing has become not just a method of recording, but a foundation of information stability across space and time emerges as these tablets circulate between cities. Administrative systems rely on this written continuity to coordinate distant regions and maintain order. It allows governance to extend beyond presence through preserved records guiding decisions across generations steadily. In marketplaces, you see a steady flow of goods and interactions shaped by predictable systems. Prices, measures, and exchanges follow established norms that reduce confusion and disputes. There is a quiet sense of trust in these systems, as if people have learned to rely on structure as part of their everyday environment rather than as an external imposition. You observe that local leaders now operate within clearly defined hierarchies. Their authority is connected to larger administrative frameworks, ensuring alignment between regional decisions and imperial coordination. Yet their presence remains familiar to the people they govern, preserving a sense of continuity even as structural relationships become more formalized. Historically, this period reflects how imperial systems, such as the Neo-Assyrian state, developed advanced administrative networks that allowed information, taxation, and governance to function across vast territories with increasing efficiency. You sense how records, messengers, and organized routes create a connected framework, enabling distant regions to operate under shared expectations while still maintaining their local structures and daily rhythms. You sense how these systems depend not only on authority, but also on infrastructure that makes coordination both practical and sustainable over long distances across diverse landscapes. Roads, relay stations, and standardized procedures allow information to move reliably between centers. Power here is not only command, but also the quiet design of systems that keep communication and organization continuously functioning. As you walk through rural areas, daily life appears calm and uninterrupted. Farmers continue their work, families gather in familiar routines, and seasonal cycles guide agricultural activity. Beneath this continuity, however, lies a structured system that ensures resources flow efficiently between regions, connecting local life to broader imperial organization without disrupting its natural rhythm. You begin to realize that power in this world no longer feels distant or unfamiliar across cities and regions. It has become embedded in routines, schedules, and systems that people interact with daily. Authority is no longer something that arrives from outside, but something experienced through repeated, predictable interactions shaping the structure of ordinary life everywhere. In the fading light of evening, roads remain active with steady movement of traders, messengers, and local travelers. Communication continues along established routes that connect distant settlements in a quiet, organized flow. Everything feels coordinated without feeling forced, as if the entire region has learned how to function within a shared rhythm of predictable exchange. Stability here is not static or frozen in time, but maintained through continuous, quiet alignment of many small systems working together. Administration, trade, and local governance adjust constantly in subtle ways. You sense how balance is preserved not by rigidity, but by ongoing cooperation between countless interconnected processes that sustain everyday life across the land. You stand within this calm imperial structure, sensing that its strength lies not in visible power, but in consistency and integration over long periods of time. Life continues smoothly because systems support it invisibly, and people adapt naturally as predictability becomes part of their environment. And as night settles, gently, the story flows onward in quiet continuity. You continue your journey through Mesopotamia, where the land feels unchanged in its physical shape, yet the meaning of its boundaries has quietly shifted once again. Borders exist here, but they are no longer sharp or absolute. Instead, they resemble soft transitions, where influence fades gradually from one region into another, without clear points of separation. As you walk along ancient routes, you notice how administrative markers appear more frequently, indicating regions of taxation and governance. Yet these markers do not form rigid lines. They feel more like references than barriers, guiding organization rather than restricting movement. People pass through them without hesitation, as if borders are concepts rather than physical realities. In many cities, systems of law and taxation have become more widely standardized. Rules that once varied between local regions now share common structures, allowing governance to function more consistently across distances. You sense that this standardization brings a quiet sense of predictability, even as local traditions continue to shape everyday interactions in subtle ways. Markets remain active, and trade flows with increasing regularity. Goods move across regions under shared administrative expectations, reducing uncertainty for merchants and travelers. You observe how this consistency does not erase local identity, but instead overlays it with a broader framework that allows exchange to happen more smoothly. And with fewer disruptions, writing continues to grow in importance across all levels of society. Records are no longer limited to temples or central authorities, but are increasingly used in everyday transactions. You see scribes and traders alike relying on written agreements to confirm exchanges, suggesting that documentation has become a universal tool for maintaining order and trust. Historically, this period reflects the emergence and influence of early legal systems, such as the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most complete and structured law codes from ancient Mesopotamia. You sense how societies begin organizing justice through written authority, creating consistency across regions with different customs and traditions. You sense how such systems represent an effort to unify diverse practices under a shared framework of recorded rules and expectations that can be preserved over time. This codification reduces ambiguity, allowing governance to extend beyond local interpretation, and slowly shapes how communities understand order, responsibility, and collective behavior across generations. As you pass through older cities, you notice that they still exist much as they always have, with familiar streets, temples, and markets. However, their administrative leadership now aligns with broader governing structures. The cities themselves remain intact, but the way they are managed has shifted into a larger network of authority and coordination. Local administrators continue their work with familiar routines, though now guided by standardized regulations that apply across multiple regions and settlements. You observe how governance becomes less about individual interpretation and more about following established codes. This creates a sense of consistency, where decisions are shaped by shared rules rather than isolated local discretion within each city. In conversations among residents, you hear references to laws that apply beyond their immediate city or community. Boundaries. People speak of regulations as something that exists across regions, not just within their own local environment. This awareness suggests that identity is beginning to extend beyond local belonging, slowly incorporating a broader sense of participation within a larger governing system. You walk past scribes, carefully copying legal texts onto clay tablets, ensuring that standardized laws are preserved, transmitted, and distributed across administrative centers. Their work feels meticulous and repetitive, yet essential to maintaining coherence across the expanding system. Each inscription represents not only information, but also alignment between distant cities connected through shared governance. Trade caravans continue to move steadily along established routes, carrying goods and written records between cities and regions. These journeys appear routine, yet they reflect a deeper integration of administrative order across space. Markets, roads, and supply systems function together, creating continuity between economic activity and formal governance structures. Across multiple territories, you notice how documentation travels alongside physical commodities, reinforcing the integration of legal, economic, and administrative systems across the land. It feels as if writing itself has become part of the infrastructure that supports movement, exchange, and coordination. Through these records, distant regions remain connected, allowing systems of governance to extend far beyond their immediate centers. Historically, the Code of Hammurabi stands as one of the earliest known examples of a comprehensive written legal system. You sense how such codification reflects a broader shift toward formalized governance, where rules are not only practiced, but permanently recorded in durable form. This creates continuity across time, allowing authority to extend beyond individual rulers and personal interpretation. Even as administrative systems expand across Mesopotamia, older cultural practices remain visible in daily life throughout cities and rural settlements. Rituals, festivals, and local customs continue to shape community identity with quiet persistence. You observe how these traditions coexist with standardized governance, creating a layered social structure where formal systems and lived experience operate side without fully merging into one. You notice that people adapt to these overlapping systems with remarkable ease, even when regulations become more complex over time. Rather than resisting change, they incorporate new administrative requirements into familiar routines of work, trade, and social interaction. Life continues with a strong sense of continuity, as if the world is learning to hold multiple layers of order simultaneously without losing stability or rhythm. As evening settles across the landscape, cities appear calm and unchanged on the surface, with familiar sounds of daily life slowly fading into stillness. Yet beneath this visible calm, administrative systems continue to operate, connecting regions through shared codes, records, and structured communication. You sense how governance now extends beyond visible authority into written system shaping interaction across distances. You stand at the edge of this evolving network of borders and laws, realizing that boundaries here are not endings, but transitions between systems of influence. Authority does not stop at lines on a map, but flows through them like wind through open space, subtle and continuous. And as light fades gently from the sky, the story flows onward into quiet unfolding. Everything around you suggests that order is no longer a single structure, but a collection of interconnected layers that overlap and interact across time. You feel how governance, culture, and daily life are increasingly interwoven, forming a system that is both stable and flexible. In this quiet complexity, the world continues its slow transformation without breaking its underlying sense of continuity. You continue walking through Mesopotamia, but the atmosphere around you feels slightly different, as if the horizon itself is beginning to carry unfamiliar currents. Nothing changes abruptly, yet there is a sense that distant regions are slowly becoming more active, more present, and more influential in ways that are not immediately visible to those living within the older centers of power. As you move along the familiar river routes, You hear scattered references to lands far beyond the traditional heartlands. These regions are no longer spoken of as remote or irrelevant. Instead, they are beginning to emerge as meaningful participants in the broader balance of influence. You sense that the world is quietly expanding its center of gravity without announcing it directly. Trade networks continue to function steadily, but their direction feels subtly different. Goods now travel through routes that connect not only established cities, but also emerging centers of authority in distant regions. You notice how movement itself begins to reflect a shifting map of influence, even though the physical landscape remains unchanged beneath the same steady sky. In conversations among travelers, you hear cautious recognition of new powers forming at the edges of the known world. These are not sudden arrivals, but gradual accumulations of strength and organization. People speak of them without urgency, as if acknowledging changes that have been unfolding for some time without clear beginning or visible origin. Historically, this period reflects the early developments that eventually lead to the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great across interconnected regions. You sense how long-term political and cultural shifts gradually prepare the conditions for larger imperial structures to emerge from previously separate and independent territories. You sense how this transformation does not occur in isolation, but through the combination of multiple regions, cultures, and administrative systems into a more unified structure that still allows for local diversity. This balance creates cohesion without erasing identity, forming a flexible imperial model that integrates differences rather than eliminating them completely. As you pass through older cities, their daily life continues without interruption. Markets remain active, temples continue their rituals, and administrative systems function as before. Yet beneath this continuity, you feel a quiet awareness that larger frameworks of power are gradually forming beyond their immediate perception. Reshaping long-term relationships between regions. You begin to notice that power no longer flows exclusively from traditional centers. Instead, it emerges from a broader network of regions that are learning to coordinate across distance. This creates a more distributed form of influence, where strength is built through connection rather than concentration in a single dominant location. In rural areas, life remains steady and largely unchanged. Farmers continue working their fields, guided by seasonal cycles that feel constant and reliable. Yet even here, subtle signs of broader integration appear in trade patterns and administrative references. You realize that large-scale change often reaches everyday life only after it has already taken shape elsewhere. Caravan routes stretching across long distances feel increasingly organized, as if multiple regions are aligning their systems for smoother interaction. You observe how coordination becomes more important than control, allowing different areas to function together without requiring uniformity. This approach creates stability while preserving regional variation in customs and practices. A historical truth becomes clearer as you reflect on the emerging structure of power in this era. Cyrus the Great is remembered for uniting diverse territories under the Achaemenid Empire, combining administrative efficiency with a degree of cultural and political tolerance. You sense how this approach differs from earlier models of consolidation. As you walk through bustling marketplaces, you hear traders discussing distant regions with growing familiarity and practical awareness in their conversations. These places are no longer unknown or abstract concepts separated from daily life. Instead, they are gradually becoming integrated into shared economic and political understanding, shaping how people think about distance, exchange, and connection. Across expanding networks of interaction. In administrative centers, record-keeping continues to expand in both scope and complexity as systems evolve over time. Information from distant regions is carefully collected and incorporated into broader frameworks of governance, allowing coordination across greater distances than before. You observe how documentation becomes an essential tool for maintaining cohesion within an increasingly interconnected network of territories and institutions. Despite these changes, there is no single moment of disruption or dramatic transition across the regions you observe. Instead, everything unfolds gradually, as if the world is quietly adjusting its internal structure over long periods of time. You realize that historical transformation often lacks clear boundaries, existing instead as a continuous process of alignment, adaptation, and subtle reorganization. You pass by travelers who describe unfamiliar regions with a sense of curiosity rather than fear or uncertainty. Their voices carry impressions of distant places that are becoming more accessible and connected. These descriptions suggest that the world is slowly becoming more integrated, with fewer areas existing in isolation and more regions participating in shared systems of movement and exchange. Even distant territories are beginning to feel part of a larger system of movement, trade, and shared influence across long distances. Caravans, messengers, and merchants connect once separated lands through increasingly regular routes. You sense how interaction itself becomes a binding force, gradually weaving together communities that once functioned independently within their own local environments. As evening approaches, the landscape appears calm and unchanged, yet your awareness of its underlying structure feels noticeably different and expanded. You begin to see how new centers of power are forming, not through sudden expansion, but through gradual integration of many smaller regions into coordinated systems of governance, administration, and exchange across vast distances. These emerging structures do not replace older systems immediately, but instead absorb and align them over time through practical coordination. Local traditions and regional practices continue to exist, yet they increasingly operate within broader frameworks of organization. You sense how influence spreads quietly, not by force, but through steady alignment of systems that support stability and interaction. You stand at the edge of this unfolding transformation, sensing that the world is quietly preparing for a new configuration of balance and influence across its regions. Nothing has fully changed yet, but everything is beginning to move in a new direction through gradual connection. And as the light fades across the horizon, the story continues forward in its slow, continuous rhythm. You continue walking through Mesopotamia. The land feels less like a place of change and more like a memory of everything that has already changed before. The rivers still move with quiet certainty, yet they seem older somehow, as if they have witnessed every rise of order, every shift of power, and every return to silence. As you look across the horizon, you begin to understand that what you have seen is not a single story, but a repetition of patterns across long stretches of time. Cities rise, organize, expand, and gradually transform. Yet the land itself remains patient and unchanged, holding every version of human structure, without preference or resistance. Every system of power you encountered was once new. Each administration, each empire, each organized structure began as a fresh flow of coordination. Instead, they appeared as temporary arrangements, shaped by necessity and sustained only for as long as conditions allowed. Historically, you realize that this is true across all known early civilizations, from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to later empires that followed across different regions. Each one formed its own structure of governance, expanded its influence over surrounding territories, and eventually dissolved or transformed into something new through gradual processes shaped by time and changing conditions. Nothing remained fixed, yet nothing completely disappeared either from the broader pattern of human history. You begin to sense how systems persist in altered forms, even after their original structures fade. Cultural practices, administrative methods, and shared knowledge often continue beyond the lifespan of any single empire, reshaped but not erased by succeeding generations. You begin to sense that power does not vanish when it ends, but instead changes form, passing into new systems, new languages, and new ways of organizing human life across time. What once appeared as authority becomes structure, and what once felt like control becomes memory, embedded within future arrangements that quietly carry forward its influence. As you walk through quiet fields and abandoned administrative spaces, you notice how life continues. Regardless of political change across distant regions, farmers still tend their land, rivers still nourish the soil, and communities gather with steady routines. People are shaped more by geography and necessity than by the names of rulers, who once governed these lands from faraway centers of authority. You begin to understand that human life is remarkably continuous, even when systems above it shift dramatically. Governments change, boundaries move, and records are rewritten, yet daily existence remains anchored in simple rhythms. Eating, working, resting, and moving through space continue with steady familiarity, as if human life itself naturally prefers continuity over sudden disruption or instability. There is a calm realization forming within you that history is not a sequence of isolated events, but a slow layering of organizational patterns across generations. Each empire builds upon what came before it, reshaping inherited systems rather than replacing them entirely. Institutions evolve gradually, carrying forward structures that adapt rather than disappear completely over time. Even collapse does not erase structure. It simply redistributes it into new configurations that emerge elsewhere. What falls apart in one place becomes foundation in another, continuing the cycle of organization. You sense that nothing is truly lost in this process, only transformed as human systems adjust and reassemble through shifting conditions and enduring patterns. You notice how rivers continue their movement without regard for political transitions. Water flows through the same channels, regardless of who claims ownership of the land it passes through. This constancy becomes a quiet metaphor for time itself, suggesting that deeper forces operate independently of human attempts to define or control them. A historical truth becomes clearer here. No empire in Mesopotamia or beyond has ever remained permanent. From early Sumerian city-states to the Akkadian system, from Babylonian governance to later imperial structures, each civilization represents a temporary arrangement within a much longer continuity of human organization and adaptation. As you reflect on this, you begin to see that what humans call power is often just coordination at scale, across time and space. It organizes resources, people, and information for a period of stability, then gradually dissolves as conditions change. Yet the need for coordination remains constant, ensuring that new systems always emerge where older ones fade away. You walk through spaces where once administrative centers now stand quiet, their purpose absorbed into memory and layered history. Yet even in their silence, there is no sense of loss or finality. Instead, there is continuity, as if the structures themselves were never meant to last, only to guide temporary stages of human development across shifting generations of societies. You begin to feel that time itself does not move in straight lines here, but in overlapping cycles that repeat with variation. Each era rises, stabilizes, and returns into transformation, not as failure or collapse, but as natural progression. Civilizations leave traces behind, yet those traces become foundations for new arrangements that quietly follow. Civilization behaves like breathing, expanding and contracting across long intervals, without ever fully stopping its underlying rhythm. What appears as rise or fall is only part of a larger continuity of adjustment. You sense that human history is less a sequence of endings and beginnings, and more a continuous unfolding of interconnected cycles. As the light begins to soften across the landscape, you notice how everything appears gently connected, yet quietly separate. The past is not gone, but layered beneath the present. The present is not final, but are we leaning toward what will come next? And the future feels less like arrival and more like continuation. You stand in this quiet understanding, realizing that silence itself carries meaning here. It is not empty, but full of everything that has already unfolded and everything that will eventually return in different forms. The land holds this silence without tension, as if it has learned to remember without holding on. And as night settles gently over Mesopotamia, you feel the final truth of this journey. Everything returns slowly, not as repetition, but as transformation across time. Power, people, and empires all move through this vast rhythm, shaping and reshaping each other without end. And in that deep, quiet awareness, the story fades softly into stillness.